Welcome back to History and Politics Chat at 4 o'clock on Tuesday. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. Actually, somebody asked me why I always use that disclaimer when I do these. How am I different in the classroom? I do tend to editorialize in these. I do not editorialize in a classroom, and that is because of the difference, to my mind, in the power dynamic between adults who choose to come and listen to me and younger adults, they're still adults, but younger adults who are there to learn the skill set. I think you're probably listening for my ideas. They're learning how to do history on their own. So that's why I say that, and that's why I do it. And plus, I shouldn't make my employer responsible for my opinions, that's for sure. All right, so I'm actually really glad I came today because I'm actually writing something really cool, and I was thinking, maybe they don't care that much if I come today because I'm really into what I'm doing. And then I started looking at your commentary on what you would like to have answered, and I sort of feel like y'all need a pep talk. And the answer to that is that, I'm reading these comments from you and how frustrated and distressed so many of you are about where the country is, and you should be. But I'm unhappy with the level of despair and the sense that the game is over, that we have lost, that American democracy is done, and that we are simply going to ride to perdition on the back of the current administration of the United States. And I really want to call your attention to that and to that despair. Mind you, I'm not suggesting any course of action for people who feel like they need to prepare to leave the country. I know people who've done that. But to say that it's never a good idea to give up before you're forced to give up. One of the things that the scholars of authoritarian regimes will tell you is never give your permission in advance, and never say, there's nothing we can do. Oh no, it's over. Nothing's ever over until it's really over, and we're not there at all yet. We're not in a good way, for sure, but it's way too early to say we've lost. There's nothing we can do. So before I can get to your questions, I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up of some attitudes and things that you sound like you need going into this upcoming election. And the first of all is the idea, and I cannot emphasize this enough, the United States government is a government of the people, and by the people and for the people, but it is ours. It does not belong to the people we have elected. It is ours to do with as we will. Now, we could hypothetically be stopped from exercising our will, but the idea that we somehow have to do what we're told is completely wrong. It's completely antithetical to what democracy is all about. It is our government. All right, so what do we do when we're faced with this extraordinary power grab on the part of a minority of the population? Because never forget that the people who are currently in charge of us are a minority, and they represent a minority, and I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. First of all, we do not expect that we're going to have results from the 2020 election on election night. That's something that Trump is pushing very hard because he is expecting that for one reason or another, the in-person voting on November 3rd will be in his favor. And I said that very carefully for a reason. So he is trying to insist that we must have the answer to the election on the night of November 3rd. There's no reason we have to have that number. In the past, we certainly have not had it. That's very much a construction of the era of television, where they want to give you the great final conclusion. In fact, it takes time to count ballots. And in many states, so long as the ballot is postmarked, either on the day of the election before it or sometimes for a little bit of time afterward. I don't know all the state laws, but they are state laws. It'll take more time for those ballots to come in, maybe as many as 2 weeks. And then, of course, there are the ballots coming from Americans who live overseas, both in our military zones, but also expats. Although I've gotten a lot of letters from people saying, as expatriates, that this administration has made it extremely difficult for them to cast ballots. So do not expect that we're going to know who was elected on the night of November 3rd. And that being the case, do not accept that whoever is announced to be the winner on that night is the winner of that election. There's no reason we have to acquiesce in that, regardless of who seems to be on top that day. If you believe in democracy, you believe in counting ballots. So let's count the stupid ballots until we get to the end of them. So first of all, do not expect there to be any kind of a solution on November 3rd. Make yourself, your favorite meal and expect that you're going to be in a holding pattern for at least days, possibly weeks. So first of all, there is that. Do not listen to the idea that it's a done deal. But also, if somebody announces that he has won that election on November 3rd, call it what it is, a coup. Until we have counted the ballots, we do not know who has won the election. So the idea suddenly that somebody, and of course, obviously I'm referring to President Trump here, can announce that he has won, we do not have to accept that. That is a coup, and call it a coup. Don't call it confusion or, we don't know, don't stumble into a done deal. If that's the case, and if people resist, and I'm going to talk a minute about resistance, again, if we say this is not acceptable, what does that look like? It stops there from being a power grab, because if enough people say, we're not listening to you, that coup can't happen. And this for what it's worth, coups are not always successful. I mean, you hear them and you think, oh, it's going to be a terrible. No, they fail as often as they succeed. And the reason for that is because coups fail when ordinary citizens refuse to accept the new status. They refuse to accept what the people trying to launch a coup are doing. They just simply say that we are not going to obey this new government. And the key to this, one of the keys to this, is literally the people in charge, are the people who work in fields where they are associated or adjacent to the government. If you can't find a clerk to take a message or a secretary to write down a message, you can't deliver a message. So that sort of resistance, simply refusing to participate in a government that seems illegitimate, is itself a way to stop a coup. But it's also possible for ordinary Americans like you and me who are not working in government to make sure that nobody takes power against our will. And I want to emphasize here really strongly that one of the major things here is nonviolent resistance. Now, I'm sure some people are going to say to me, no, you got to fight back. Unfortunately, fighting back violently it tends to add legitimacy to the people trying to launch a coup. So nonviolent resistance, the way that people have seen on TV in, for example, Belarus, that sort of nonviolent resistance where people simply say, we are not going to listen to this new government, and we're not going to do what it says until there comes a point when there is really very little way for them to impose their will on people who refuse to have that will imposed. And one of the pieces of that is to recognize in nonviolent resistance, physical resistance, to emphasize not people but principles. The principles on which we're resisting a coup attempt, not because we don't like the guy who's taking over, but because it is not what we stand for, that we stand on principle. And to talk, as I try and do in the letters, which is why I'm writing the letters, to hammer again and again and again on the principles of democracy. Whether or not you like somebody, you believe in the principles of how things are supposed to happen. And a lot of people who are not necessarily on the same side politically in the short term do share a belief in principles. And one of the tricks here is to think ahead of time about what that looks like for you. What does it mean? Does it mean that you simply are going to go, oh no, and then sort of go along with things? Or are you going to think about what it looks like for you to resist a coup, to resist somebody coming in and taking over the government, simply saying, no, I'm not going to go along with this. What does this look like? At what point, and how do you say no? I'm not going along with the new boss again. And I really emphasize here nonviolence. And I don't emphasize that just because I'm trying not to get you people in trouble, but because historically in America, nonviolent resistance is successful, violent resistance is not. So nonviolent resistance is a much more effective way, at least in America. I can't speak for other countries, at least in America, to try and stop a coup. And always what you want to do is act in ways that support what you believe in. And I hope that if you're here listening to me, you believe in the rule of law, you believe in stability, and you believe in nonviolence. So you're always trying to say, to hold people account to the law, which is what America stands for, rather than simply couching it as we hate this guy. The answer is this is not a playing out of our rule of law. And the other thing that I think is maybe most crucial, having read your messages, is that it feels like, and this is actually something that the rise of authoritarian governments try to do, or governments try and do as they rise, is to make you afraid, and to make you feel like you've got to go along. And I will emphasize again here something that many people have said about the Trump administration since the beginning. He is using the playbook of abusers, and the idea of making you constantly afraid so you don't recognize your own power, so you feel like you have to do what he says, is very much part of his destabilizing people, his constant happening. Constantly, we're checking our phones, we're nervous, we don't know what's coming next, we don't know how to react to things. That is absolutely in the abuser's playbook. And the answer to that is to center yourself in what you believe in. Not in reacting to fear, but to sort of say, you know what, I can wait to hear what the results of the election are. I believe in American democracy. These are the things I care about. And to decenter him, if you will, and to kind of move him off stage, because the reality is that if you actually can take a larger view of what's going on has gone on in the last 4 years. In 2016, Trump was an event. He held a press conference, everyone showed up. He said crazy things, everybody reacted. And now he says stuff like yesterday when he declared New York City, Seattle, and Portland, Oregon, all anarchist jurisdictions or something. Look, I can't even remember. Now, if he had said that in 2016, there would have been talk shows about it and newspapers about it and op-eds about it, and everybody would be wondering how it would play out. And now it's like the boy has cried wolf way too many times, and we're all sort of just like, go away. And that's a real problem for him, because unless he can continue to gin up that fear and that attention, he doesn't have a lot to go on. So and when that happens, when we can decenter him and instead focus on the things that we, as the owners of this government, care about, it will make it a lot easier to articulate what America really should look like. Now, am I promising you that things are not going to go bad in a big way? No, I can't promise that. But I can promise you it's way too early to say we're done for. It's just way too early for that. And again, if you don't believe me, think about it this way. Trump and Barr and the people supporting them would not be fighting like they are. They would not be standing in front of polling places. They would not be threatening people with guns. They would not be making these crazy ads that are completely fake. They would not be doing these things if it were a done deal. They wouldn't need to. They would already have won. So the fact that they're fighting the way they are suggests that they know what some of you seem to have forgotten, and that's that it is not over yet. All right, so so that was just my pep talk, because American history is not clean, and there's no period in which people have been able to say, hey, it's great, it's free sailing from now on. We're in a particularly bad time for sure, but I promise you, in 1863, you did not know how it was going to come out. In 1943, you did not know how it was going to come out. And all you can do is put one foot in front of the other and make a plan, and make a plan for how you are going to stand as the days move on. All right, so that's my pep talk. And let me go ahead to some of your questions. I'm sorry, let me add one more thing to that. Don't get obsessed with this. I mean, you do have to pay attention. I hope I'm helping you do that. But still do what you love. You know, your life has not ended yet. And you know, take time out. Take some days off of this. You know, I promise you, I'll keep watching. I'll make sure you're involved. But it's not just me. I mean, we got to spell each other. So so don't drive yourself crazy with this. I know a lot of people are having a hard time with where we are and the fear and all that, but it's okay to take a break and to look away and to come back refreshed. That's come back if you would, but it's okay to take time off. All right, so you guys asked some questions, and you will be shocked, I say, to hear that they're mostly about the Supreme Court. And this is a really interesting question, and I'm going to walk you through some of the many aspects of it, but I'm also going to try and put it into context of where we are with it and why it matters. All right, so there's a number of questions, and the first I'm going to start is from Liz Evans, and she said, like, really, and again, once again, when I do this, I'm paraphrasing what people say. They sound a lot more intelligent when they write to me than when I paraphrase what they're saying. So Liz says, how does this situation now differ from 2016 regarding the appointment of a Supreme Court justice in an election year? I've heard it's because we need a full Supreme Court to settle the potentially challenged election that is coming up, but couldn't it be said that 2016 had the same problem? Why and how are the Republicans justifying it now when they did not in 2016? And the answer to that is this is simply a power grab. And you know, I don't say things like that lightly. The issue is this. There is no problem appointing a Supreme Court justice in an election year. It's been done 14 times in our history, and 3 times in our history, there has been a nomination after the election in December. So 17 times in our history, we have had a Supreme Court nominee come up in an election year. So the fact that McConnell said that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican from Kentucky, said in 2016 that it would not be possible for Barack Obama to nominate a Supreme Court justice because it was an election year and people should vote on who they wanted to have nominate that person. That was completely made up. And it was really quite insulting, if you think about it, because the people did vote. They gave Barack Obama a 4-year term. And this is the first time that had ever been done. And so McConnell said that it was inappropriate to go ahead and confirm a justice during an election year. And if there was a real mistake in that, although I think people weren't paying close enough attention, the Democrats should have made a much bigger stink about that, because that was completely unprecedented. And Merrick Garland was, interestingly enough, quite a moderate. So Obama had, in fact, conferred with Republicans on the appointment of Garland, and Merrick Garland had been approved to the seat at which he now sits unanimously. So he was a very well-regarded justice on both sides of the aisle. But that wasn't the point. McConnell wanted to save that seat for a Republican coming next. And as you've heard me say before, that makes me very suspicious of what McConnell knew in 2016, because every sign said that it was going to be Hillary Clinton winning in 2016. So one of the things McConnell wanted to do is he wanted to hold that seat back so that it would inspire Republicans to get out and vote even if they didn't like Trump, so they would vote for that Supreme Court nominee. But it also suggested that he had perhaps a bit more knowledge about what was going to happen in 2016 than the rest of us, and that makes me very, very nervous. And I could game that out for you, but I won't right now. But so if that's the case, what happened? Well, the argument was that Barack Obama couldn't appoint a justice, but it wasn't just Merrick Garland that McConnell held back. He also held back a number of other justices, and what that meant was it created this backlog. And if you've wondered how Trump had all these positions to fill, it's in part because McConnell had held so many back from Obama. So there was actually already a backlog. So Trump just came in and he's been slamming in those judges at an unbelievable pace. Even during coronavirus, when everybody else shut down, the Senate stayed in session and continued to put through judges. And even still, of course, although the Senate says it can't possibly find time to debate a new coronavirus relief brief bill, it says it can find time to put in a Supreme Court justice. All right, so McConnell's argument, flimsy though it was, for having the right not to pull up this nomination of Merrick Garland in 2016 was what has been called the Biden rule. And the Biden rule is not a rule at all. It's a speech that Joe Biden, who was then the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, gave in 1992, in which he, hold on a second, let me find my notes on that. In 1992, in which he said, listen, after the Clarence Thomas hearings, which were so contentious, he said, if another vacancy arises, it would be a good thing if it held off until after the election. Not at all during the election, but hold off until after the election, because we're destroying the nonpartisanship, and we're destroying the reputation of the Supreme Court, and this is not okay. It was never a rule. It was never voted on. There was no vacancy before the Supreme Court when he said it, and none came up. It was him trying to say, let's take politics out of Supreme Court vacancies. And what he was talking about was what I wrote about the other night. And that is that after World War II, especially under Dwight Eisenhower, and I'll tell you a little bit more about FDR in a minute, under Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Court, under the Republicans, by the way, especially former Governor Earl Warren, a Republican governor of California, had used the Supreme Court to level the playing field among races and genders in America. So, for example, we got the Brown versus Board of Education decision. We got the Miranda decision, which which required police officers to read rights to people that they had arrested. We got a number of we got the redistricting rule of one person, one vote, so that you couldn't have one district that literally had a few hundred people in it and another as several thousand. There were all kinds of things that were designed to level the playing field, and that continued after Warren stepped down from the bench and was replaced by another Republican. And under him, we got Brown versus Board of Education. Roe versus Wade of 1973. And Roe v. Wade is, everyone keeps screaming now about how the Democrats did this and the Democrats forced this on the country. It's a Republican decision. It was written by Harry Blackmun. He's a Republican appointed by Richard Nixon. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in that session was also a Republican. And that's Warren Burger. And the decision Roe v. Wade was decided 7-2. It's not some wild lefty thing. It was part of the Republican, at the time, program to try and level the playing field, which itself is a really, I wrote about the Republican Party, and I think this is actually really interesting and a really interesting part of Republican ideology, and one that we've sort of thrown out the window nowadays. But it's an important one, and it's important for this context. So this Warren court, and then later the Burger court, went ahead and used the Supreme Court to level the playing field. And people who opposed to those things, especially on the grounds of civil rights, began to argue for something that eventually, not at the time, but eventually they called judicial activism, or legislating from the bench. And those are both two phrases that are going to come into use primarily during the Reagan administration, and then to go on and be used since then. And what they argued, people who opposed to this leveling of the playing field, was that these unelected judges were changing American society by changing the law from the bench. And what those people who opposed these new decisions wanted was they wanted justices who would not do that. And so there is a real move afoot among them to go ahead and to change the kind of judges that they put on the bench. And this comes to the fore during Ronald Reagan, primarily over the fight, over Justice Bork, Robert Bork. And a lot of people were unhappy I didn't talk about Bork the other day. I kind of thought that he was covered by the Clarence Thomas fight because it's a similar fight, but also because I didn't have space. I mean, people get unhappy about the fact I don't say one thing or another. I got 1,200 words. That's 4 pages, and that's a lot. A lot of news and a lot of history every day to fit into 4 pages. So, so I didn't cover Bork, so I will here. The reason that there was such a fight over Robert Bork, and I hear this again and again, Bork was so smart, he should have been on the court, and instead Thomas, who's not nearly as smart, I mean, I'm saying what I'm hearing, I'm not making a judgment here, managed to get on. What the heck happened? Why did the Democrats stop Bork? Bork was so smart, he should have been there. The Democrats stopped Bork because Bork, 2 reasons. First of all, because, and this feels like it's in the weeds, but it's so important. You remember the Saturday Night Massacre when Nixon fired the people who were closing in on him, the special prosecutor, to stop him from closing in on him? And the members of the Justice Department resigned rather than the top 2 resigned rather than carrying out that order of the Saturday Night Massacre. The person who did carry out the order, Robert Bork, 3rd person in line at the Justice Department. But so people had a bad feeling about that. That suggested that he was on board with the idea of the unitary executive, a very strong executive. But they were also unhappy with him because he really advocated what, again, has come to be called originalism, or the idea of a strict interpretation of the Constitution. And what that means is, as it is embodied in somebody like Antonin Scalia, is that the Constitution is what the founders said when they wrote it. And unless something is explicitly enumerated in that Constitution, you can't do it can't be done. And what that means, of course, is that all of the things that the Warren Court, for example, did are unconstitutional. They're not legal for them to have done because they're not in the original Constitution. The founders certainly never thought about the desegregation of public schools. They were enslavers themselves, and they certainly didn't think about reading rights to arrested suspects, because it just was beyond anything they could have imagined. What they are doing is they're kind of taking a look at the expansion of rights under the law after World War II and saying you simply can't do that. And for what it's worth, and this some of you may have tuned out already and, I don't know, gone for a walk, so maybe whatever. This is the heart of the critical race theory that has Donald Trump so tied up in a knot right now. People who studied the law in the 1950s argued that, in fact, the way you created social change was to change the laws. And one of the most important books that did that, one of the most famous books that did that, was C. Vann Woodward's book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, in which he said, and I'm not going to go into a historical examination of this book, but the point of that book was that the only way you got a division between white Americans and black Americans was when the law imposed one. Until then, everybody not got along fine, but he said this is why you have to recognize that the law is not neutral, that the law creates our society, and that if you want to change our society, you have to change the law. That's really what's at the center of critical race theory. And so when Trump says this is horrible indoctrination or whatever, what he is saying is we should not be recognizing that our legal system does in fact create at least racial, but also gendered boundaries. All right, so if that's the case, so to go back to the Supreme Court, so what Bork is saying is, I'm going to roll back. I mean, not literally saying this, but he was open that he was going to roll back the civil rights legislation of the Warren Court. So when the Democrats are jumping all over him, and he's a very bright man, they're jumping over him not in principle, that they don't want to put somebody on the court who is going to roll back the idea of using the Supreme Court to enforce equal rights under law, which is what's written on the Supreme Court. All right, so how does that bring us to where we are now? All right, so it brings us to where we are now because obviously, because McConnell held this seat back, and because we've had 4 justices seated by 2 presidents who were not elected by the popular vote, George W. Bush and Donald J. Trump. What we have now is a court that is already heavily weighted toward people who do not believe, who believe in originalism, who are strict constructionists, who want to roll back that idea that you can change society based on the way that the Supreme Court interprets the law. So this is why this last vote is so important, and why keeping Merrick Garland, who was a moderate, but who did believe in the idea that the courts could level the playing field, why that was such a big deal to keep him off. So this is why this particular moment is so fraught. If we permit there to be a Supreme Court that in fact does embrace this strict interpretation of the Constitution, it is logical for it to unwind all of the legislation since World War II that has leveled the playing field amongst people of color and for women. And again, people focus on Brown versus Board of Education, on Roe v. Wade, but it has to do with a lot of other things as well. Remember, this court has already unwound the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it again is standing to examine the Affordable Care Act and the other pieces of legislation that they very well might consider unconstitutional, because they believe under the Constitution that the government can only do what the founders said it could do back in the 1700s. And that's a position, by the way, that I write about in my last book, because that's exactly the same position that the Southern Democrats, who were the large slave owners in the 1850s, took in order to stop there being any challenge to their economic authority as well as their social authority. They were strict constructionists of the Constitution, and that's sort of its own interesting thing. All right, so that's maybe more than you wanted on that. So let me go ahead and get to some of the other questions you have asked about the Supreme Court. And that is, people have asked about what can the Democrats do? What are we hearing about adding more seats to the court? Is that legal? What's going to happen? I'm sorry. Let me just finish with Liz's question. It's still in front of me here. So McConnell made that rule up. He based it on something that was not a rule, and now he's changing it. And now he's changing it because there's different parties in charge of different things. That's crap. He's making it up as he goes along. He's simply going ahead and taking the power because he can, because he's the Senate Majority Leader. But that is this next part of the question that you all have asked is, can the Democrats, if they get control of the Senate, expand the courts? Sure. There is nothing in the Constitution about the number of judges on the Supreme Court. The Congress actually decided the original number of justices in the Judicial Act of 1789, actually quite an important law itself. And at the time it said 6. Then it changed, Congress changed the number of judges 6 times before it finally settled on our current 9 in 1869. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about changing those numbers in a second, but it is absolutely worth remembering, I think, that we've had 2 really major changes since this early era of judges. One is that people live a lot longer than they used to. And that matters because you simply would not have had justices in their late 80s in the early years because people didn't live that long. And here's the second thing that has matters a lot for the Supreme Court, and that's transportation. Because in the original days, if you're going back to the original here, in the original days of the Supreme Court, you literally rode the circuit on horse. And you had to travel by horseback to the courts and to the Supreme Court. And that meant it was very much a young person's game. And that change now, I mean, I meaning no disrespect to the elderly justices we've had, they're not going to be riding a horse to court. And so we had in our system, not only in the Supreme Court, but also in Congress, in the Senate, we had a natural limit to how old people could be in those bodies and how long they could hold those seats. And that's not to say that you shouldn't have older people in those positions, but that we did used to have a natural limit that we no longer have. And that holds across the government. When, again, you look in the colonial era, the early Republic era, the people who are legislating in the early Republic are young. You know, they're in their 30s and their 40s. And you know, even in the time of the mid 19th century, it's unusual to have somebody in it's going to be a him in his 70s in Congress, because they don't live that long. And if they do, they don't want to get in a stagecoach and go, you know, across the country to get to Washington. So we have missed that. We've lost that guardrail, and it seems almost to be a third rail that we don't want to talk about. But I do think it's important, because it does say something about the relative age of our government. So not this last Congress, but the one before it was the oldest in American history. I think that matters. I'm on the older side myself, but it seems crazy to me, even at my age, the idea that I would be legislating, not that I am, but if I were in Congress, without input from the young people who are going to be living here a lot longer than I am. And I think that that's going to be something that we need to address as we think about our democracy going forward. All right, so if the Constitution doesn't set the number of judges, sure, we can play around with them every year if we want to, but we don't. And we don't because the Supreme Court has gone up and down in terms of how much it is respected throughout its history, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. But we tend not to want to mess around with the Supreme Court, because theoretically they are the arbiters of our laws. Now, there's arguments right now that they were never intended to be that. And of course, we do know that the concept of judicial review is established by Marbury v. Madison in 1803. It's not part of the original Constitution, and it's certainly not part of the original Judicial Act of 1789. And it actually don't pay a lot of attention to Marbury v. Madison, which again establishes the principle of judicial review, until the late 19th century. So today, or this week at some point, somebody had a piece saying, wait a minute, how did they get this much power anyway? I'm comfortable with the Supreme Court having judicial review, although obviously right now we've got some issues to work out. So what's happened in the past when people have gone ahead and tried to increase the number of Supreme Court justices? Most famously, it happened in 1937 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, was frustrated by the fact that the Supreme Court was striking down the efforts he was making to change the format of the American government, change the way the American government worked. He had proposed what he called a New Deal for the American people. And that was the government that we have lived with ever since. It's a government, as I keep harping on, that embraced what came to be called the liberal consensus. And that did not mean it was made up of Democrats, because Republicans signed on too, both during and after World War II, most notably with Dwight Eisenhower, who's elected in 52 and takes office in 53. It was the idea that the government, rather than being like the originalists would have it, that the government actually had a role to play in regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, and promoting infrastructure. And those three keys were things that both Democrats and Republicans signed on to. But the Supreme Court, which when FDR inherited it, tended to be much older, and had tended to have gotten onto the court during a time when the government did not do those things, tended to turn against that, to call FDR's legislation unconstitutional. So after he wins re-election in 1936, FDR figures he's going to get rid of these guys, and he goes ahead and he gives us He makes this proposal saying, you know, the Supreme Court justices, I feel so sorry for them. They're so old. They have too much work. I'm going to make their lives easier by adding more justices to the court. Well, it's obvious what he's doing, and there's a huge backlash, and it does not succeed. It's known as court packing, and it doesn't succeed. And we never get those additional 6 justices on the court that FDR wants. But what happens in the wake of that is the Supreme Court sees the writing on the wall, and it stops killing his legislation. So even though he doesn't get his justices, he does get the decisions he would like, for the most part. So here's the question: should the Democrats do that, and what are they talking about now? So here's my read on it, and I could be wrong, but here's my read on it. My read on it is that with the Republican power grab over this Supreme Court seat. Now remember, numbers of Republicans are on the record from 2016 saying you can't put a justice on the Supreme Court during an election year. You can quote me on that. Lindsey Graham is these words can come back to haunt me because I believe this. If the shoe were on the other foot, I'd do this. And now, of course, they've all said the opposite. And it's very clear it's simply a naked power grab. And with that, I think the Democrats are finally doing something that many people thought they should have done before. And that is that the Democrats have operated according to norms and according to respect for traditions and respect for the spirit of the law as well as the letter of the law. And with this change, the Republicans are saying, this is great, you guys are playing by the rules and we're not. And you've actually seen that, I suspect, in some of the comments even on my Facebook page where people are going, well, if you Democrats believe so much in the rules, then you should live by the rules and you should go ahead and okay this justice. And you sit there and you read that and you think, but think of a baseball game or a soccer game. If one side is blatantly stealing goals, the answer is not to say, okay, we're going to let you steal goals, but we're going to play by the rules and let you steal more. The answer is to say, well, if you're going to use all the tools at your disposal, so are we. And I think what the Democrats are doing is they are signaling to Republican leadership that they're not going to play clean anymore. They're going to do the same thing the Republicans are doing and use any procedural things they can do in order to stop the Republicans from behaving the way they are behaving. I actually am not at all convinced that the Democrats want to put more people on the courts. That's kind of messy in a lot of different ways. I think what they are saying is, we could, so don't try us. And if they do decide to, they will have softened up enough people who, like you people who are suddenly asking about it, that it won't sound like it did when FDR tried to do it as being some kind of a power grab. It will sound much more like simply leveling the playing field. Now, a lot of people have asked me about what's going to happen to the court. Do they have to, is this the only way to change the makeup of the court? I don't think it's unreasonable to talk about expanding the number of the court, although I'm not advocating it here. You ask questions, I'm answering them. I will say that it is perfectly legitimate to impeach members of the Supreme Court or other federal judges, of course. And I think that if it were me and I were in charge and I were a Democrat in the Senate, the first thing I would do when I control the Senate would be to impeach Justice Kavanaugh, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, not to impeach him, to find out about his finances. Because if you recall, he had very large debts that disappeared right before his hearings, and nobody ever said where those debts went to. He said they were baseball debts that his friends paid back, but I would look at that paper trail. It looks very suspicious to me. And if in fact it's bad, I would impeach him. And then your numbers are back to, which seems fair, and then your numbers are back to where they should be. We have other questions as well if it turns out, in fact, that there was something untoward about the 2016 election and Donald Trump was not legitimately elected, as has been suggested. Not that I'm advocating that. I'm simply gaming this out in my head. Then you've got a real crisis. Are the Supreme Court justices he nominated legitimate? I would say they are, because they have been confirmed with the advice and consent of the Senate. But that certainly does raise questions. All right, so why do we care about any of this? We care about any of this aside from in the small way that we care about the legitimacy of our court, one of the three branches of government. But I would like to suggest that the legitimacy of the Supreme Court is part of a much larger crisis that we're in right now. And that is the crisis of the legitimacy of our government. And that is big. And that is not about Donald Trump, although it is partly about Donald Trump. It is about the fact that the way our demographics has shifted since the 1920s has created a dramatic crisis in our government, of popular government. And I'm going to start right here with 2 points. You cannot have a legitimate democratic government, and I'm all small d's here. You cannot have a legitimate democratic government if the majority of the people do not believe it represents them. That's just a given. It's not a democracy if a majority of the people don't feel it represents them. And the corollary to that is you cannot have a democracy unless you have at least 2 viable political parties. The reason for that is because you need to be able to have an opposition party to voice its dislike of the party in power. Because if you don't have that legitimacy of opposition, you don't have the ability to switch from one party to the other. You don't have rotation in office, and you don't have anyone to check the excesses of the party in power. So you need to have a majority of the American people backing the government in power, even if it's just to say, okay, I lost this time, next time my guy will be in. And you have to have two viable political parties. And right now, both of those things are in terrible danger. So let me explain why. I hope this is interesting, by the way. I love this political stuff. But I'm almost like, to me, it's personal, of course, but it's also this fascinating puzzle. And so I'm talking about political parties and how we need two and all that. And I suspect I can hear people going, but wait a minute, you want to support both parties. How can you do that? Because I care about the system much more than I care about one side or the other. I care about one side or the other personally, but I care about the system for everybody. All right, so what is our problem? Our problem is since at least 2000. I didn't really think about a beginning date when I got into that sentence. Since at least 2000, we have had the problem of leadership that does not reflect a majority of the American people. George W. Bush was not elected with a majority of the American people. And in a way, that doesn't, if it happens, as I keep saying, if it happens every once in a while as a glitch, that's okay. Things happen, but they're going to be okay the next time around. I will point out that the 4 times we have had somebody who's elected without a majority of the popular vote, each time it's been a Republican. A Democrat has never been put in office without a majority of the popular vote, which is, I always think is just chance, but 4 times seems like a lot. Anyway, George W. Bush is not backed by a majority of the American people, nor is Donald Trump. He too was elected with a minority of the popular vote. And the reason for that, of course, they're both legitimate elections because they're elected in the Electoral College. Now, our Electoral College system I've talked about a lot, but our Electoral College system, the way it is now, because of something I'm going to tell you about, skews our representation in such a way that it is possible to have a president who does not represent the American people. And that is not viable for a democracy. I mean, you can have a glitch once or twice, but at this point right now in this election, nobody is arguing that Donald Trump is going to win the popular vote. He's wildly unpopular. What people are arguing is that he's going to be able to skew the vote enough that he's going to be able to eke out a win in the Electoral College. Well, fine, that might make him legitimate in terms of the way the rules work, but it does not make him legitimate in terms of democracy. A majority of the American people will not believe that he is a legitimate president. And that's a problem for democracy. It's a problem for Donald Trump. It's a problem for us. It's also a problem for democracy. And the way that this happened was that the Electoral College, and I've talked about this a lot, so I won't talk about it in detail now, but the Electoral College was initially designed to be, the electoral votes were designed to be distributed by district. And in 1796, Thomas Jefferson recognized that if the electoral votes of the state of Virginia were allotted as a block, he would have won cleanly in 96. They do that in 1800, and that's how Thomas Jefferson wins. And once he does that, once you get the winner-take-all system, all the other states recognize that unless they do the same thing, their favorite sons are going to be dead in the water compared to Virginia. So we get the winner-take-all system in the Electoral College. And it's, from the beginning, founders like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who by that time can't agree on almost anything, agree that this is a disaster, and both of them want to change the Constitution so that the Electoral College goes back to being, electoral votes go back to being distributed by district rather than by state. Instead of winner take all, you will do it by district. And because they say we're going to get to be exactly where we are now, where you can have a president who is not supported by a majority of the people. That got significantly worse in the 1920s, and it got significantly worse in the 1920s when Congress capped the number of representatives that states could have. So we have that limit now of how many members of Congress there are, and what that does is it artificially lowers the number of Congress people that we have from our more populous states. So quite literally in the Electoral College, a vote from California has a lot more people behind it than a vote from Wyoming. And that means that people in populous states are significantly underrepresented in the Electoral College. So you can have a thing where, in fact, you get California having less representation in the government than somebody from Wyoming. And I said something on Twitter about fixing this problem, fixing the problem of the allocation of congressmen, congresspeople. The Electoral College is based on the number of senators and congressmen congresspeople that a state has. So if you increase the number of congresspeople for California or Texas or Florida or New York, their numbers in the Electoral College would go way up. And somebody was horrified, and they said, "How can you say this? You know, people are going to think you believe this, and it's just a power grab." And somebody answered quite correctly, I think. No, what we've got right now is a power grab. If you believe that everybody should have the same say in American society, why on earth should somebody in California have less of a say in their government than somebody in Wyoming? That's just not democracy. So we have that problem in terms of the problem of having a president who is not supported by a majority of the people. Now we have the same problem with the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court justices have been nominated by these people who were elected without a majority of the people behind them. And there's another problem we have, and that other problem is the problem of Congress. And because of gerrymandering in Congress, we have the problem that in a number of states, it doesn't matter how many votes the Democrats get, they are simply going to be overawed by Republicans. And the way gerrymandering works is this. Somebody asked me about this. It's your state legislature that carves up your state to decide what district you're in. And again, originally when the founders thought about this, they thought about chunks of land. And this is actually one of the things that the Warren Court takes on, because chunks of land don't vote, people vote. And that's how you got districts where you had 235 people in one and 127,000 in another, because one's in a city and one's in the middle of the country. But in very early on, politicians recognized that they could carve up the state in such a way that they could pack their opponents into one area, so that like all of your opponents, and believe me at this point, this is Elbridge Gerry we're talking about. I know it's Gerry and he gerrymandered, but he was the governor of Massachusetts, and he actually was against this system. But he was actually one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So we're talking way back in the beginning. The people in Massachusetts at the time recognized that you could crowd all your opponents into a really small space, and then all of their votes would essentially be wasted. And you could carve up the rest of the land or rest of the districts in such a way that you had your opponents in there, but you had enough of your guys that you could essentially kill all of their votes. And that's what gerrymandering is. And after the election of 2010, what happened in that election was that a number of Republican operatives got together and created something called Operation Red Map, which was Republican redistricting map project. No, I'm missing a word in there. Red Map. They're Republican majority redistricting project. And the idea was simply, instead of trying to fight over Congress every year to fight to get legislation enacted, what they did is they went to donors and said, instead of worrying about national elections, why don't you just buy up the state elections, pour money into the state elections in this even year, because this decade year, because if we, the Republicans, control the state legislature in our state, we'll divide up the state in such a way that the Democrats can't win. And that's exactly what happened. After 2010, the Republicans held the seats of Ohio, Wisconsin, Kansas, North Carolina, did I say Ohio? Possibly Pennsylvania. I don't remember. There's a whole bunch of states. And what they did is they carved them up in such a way that the Democrats really couldn't win. And they did it based on the census, which is why the census is so important. You take the numbers in the census and then you carve up your state based on that. And that's how you decide how much support you can have or how many delegates you get to Congress. So what this means is that I drew some of the statistics before I came here now, and that is that the GOP map drawn in Wisconsin, for example, in 2011, meant that Democrats had to outperform the Republicans by 10 points in order to be able to get a majority in the assembly. Well, that's unheard of in most elections, to win by that much. And in addition, what that meant is that it meant that Republicans don't really have any competition in those places, so they can get more and more and more extreme because they're so locked in they can't lose. And in our recent elections in 2014, I think it was, maybe 2016, off the top of my head, across the country, Democrats won more than 1.4 million votes for Congress people. But they, of course, had the Republicans had a majority of seats, and that in the House, and that that's baked into gerrymandering. All right, so what does this mean? What it means is that we are currently in a place where it is a lot of people think that the current government is not viable. I mean, it's not legitimate. And a lot of people think that the two-party system is not legitimate because the Democrats in some places don't stand a chance of winning. Now, people have said to me, well, what about Republicans in Massachusetts? Well, first of all, Massachusetts has a Republican governor. But second of all, it is perfectly reasonable to think that the Republicans could take the take the legislature, even in Massachusetts. But in places like Wisconsin, it simply can't be done. In Wisconsin and North Carolina, for example, it simply can't be done. Ohio. And that is why the fight this year is such a heated one, is because this will mean the redistricting for the next 10 years. So we have this problem. And of course, we have the president and the administration increasingly talking about how Democrats are illegitimate, that they are, they should not be allowed to win. Trump talked the other day about having an executive order saying that Biden couldn't be the president. I mean, he can't do that. But the point is that the delegitimization of the Democrats by the current regime is a real problem, because unless you have at least two legitimate parties that could take over, you lose democracy. And so we have this problem that we are absolutely going to have to work on. So it is almost 5 o'clock now. I'm going to answer a couple of questions more here. Quickly, Robin Fuller asked about Trump withholding funds from the cities. Can the cities hold back their monies to the states, to the government to offset that? Trump is just posturing. He can't do this. But it's just a question of what he can get away with. I mean, right now we've heard, of course, that today that the Pentagon took money that was intended to provide masks and PPE for coronavirus and put it into military supplies. That's going to be challenged in court, as well it should be. And Trump is just posturing when he says he's going to hold back money from the states. They will sue him. So that's kind of a moot point. All right. So I'm torn here between two last questions, and I guess I will save, killing me, but I guess I'm going to save the question about where conservatives have gone. That's actually the piece I was writing when I said I was thinking about not doing this because I was having so much fun writing it. Please ask me that again, the person who asked me about what happened to conservatism, because it's great story. Well, actually, next week will be good because by then the piece will be done. But let me finish then with a question here from Carrie Angelis, and that is, what is the background on Trump's idea of patriotic education versus the 1619 Project, and how could this affect teaching, and what is the precedent for this with previous presidents? So First of all, Trump's declaration the other day about wanting patriotic education is simply an attempt to stoke his base. The idea that somehow, people like me are dangerous leftists who are tearing down America. Which is an old trope. It's nothing new. We've been hearing this since at least the 1960s. The idea that we should look at things other than presidents and the excitement of America is somehow tearing the country down is just, it's kind of, I mean, to a professional, it's a little bit boring, to be honest. We've heard it so long. So first of all, he's just appealing to that base, and he's trying to turn them against the idea of the 1619 Project. And the 1619 Project came from the New York Times magazine last summer. I think I've kind of lost track of time. And what that was is a project that was designed to recenter racial issues in American society by focusing on 1619, which was the year actually that pirates came into the Chesapeake, and they exchanged a stolen cargo for supplies to go back on their little pirate life. And part of the cargo that they had stolen were enslaved human beings, and that was the origin of enslaved Africans. And I think they're Africans and not Afro-Caribbeans, although I don't remember at this point. It might be Afro-Caribbeans. To the colonies. And what they were arguing was that you need to center race in America. Now, there's a lot of complaints that you can make about the 1619 Project. One that people have pointed to a lot is that it argues that one of the major impetuses for the American Revolution was to protect slavery. And that's really kind of a stretch, to be honest. And that's the people who did it have backed off on that claim. But what they were really saying is we need, because of the moment we are in America, is we need to re-examine history. Now, people always write to me and say, what do I think about the 1619 Project? And I'm really not willing to go on record in this way about that. But I just want to emphasize that history is changing. Rather than thinking of it as something in the past that is there, we're thinking of it as a stream. And those of us who are writing it are swimming in it. And we're not always right because it's changing all the time. And that's important. It's important that we're looking at changing history. And it's important to remember as you are doing that there's a real difference between history, what really happened, and commemoration and memory. Commemoration is what values we want to lionize in our heroes. So, George Washington was an enslaver, and he was bad to the people he enslaved. Not that enslavement itself wasn't bad, but you can't lionize him on that. But he wasn't king. That's what we honor when we honor George Washington. And similarly, when you think about memory, the way people remember the past is they change the past to make it serve modern day needs. And that's one of the things that Donald Trump is doing here, is he is trying to use our past to justify his own celebration of white people, and his belief is expressed by his new desire for a Supreme Court justice that does want to go back to the days before the Warren Court, that really it's only the needs of white people, white men, that need to be taken into consideration in this, our democracy. I'm going to stop it there. I'm at the 5:04 mark, which is where I started, and my battery is running out. Thank you for being here. I will see you on Thursday if you want to finish with the Republican Party, when I suspect we'll be doing Trump. And otherwise, I will see you here next Thursday at 4 o'clock. And that's it. I've lost the battery.